In 1934, Walt Disney began production on his first feature-length animated film. Sound, color, all the techniques they utilized in the Silly Symphonies, they were all going to accumulate in one motion picture. He saw a 1916 film adaptation of Snow White starring Marguerite Clark and decided that this was going to be his first movie. In June of 1934, he announced to the New York Times that Disney was now in production of a feature-length cel-animated version of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. The studio budgeted $250,000 for this film, 10 times the budget of the average Silly Symphony. He had initially assigned a small team to work on what he was calling a feature symphony, before deciding in October of 1934 to open it up to the entire studio, at which point he decided that this would be its own standalone motion picture.
We were told by all the big movie moguls in Hollywood that people just wouldn't sit still for an hour and a half of cartoons because the bright colors would hurt your eyes. Everybody get up and walk out of there. And other people said, you're going to have gags all the way? People get tired of it. Well, Walt was a better storyteller in that he realized you had to have the pathos, the love scene, and the gags, and the chase, and all of the regular things that make a good picture.
This was a huge deal. No animated feature had ever been released to general audiences before. No one knew if anybody was actually going to want to watch a full animated movie. Cartoons were supposed to be quick little one-off gags. Now they want an audience to sit and follow for more than an hour. It's a gamble. And if they fail, it's a very expensive dud. If the movie itself didn't wow the producers at RKO, they weren't going to distribute it. So he needed to make sure that this movie was not just finished, but it was actually impressive. There was a chance that Disney was going to make this entire movie and then it was just never shown to a single person outside of Disney Studios. This would have been a catastrophic failure and absolutely closed the studio down. Disney needed to make this money back, and if it wasn't distributed, he wasn't going to be able to do that. Both his brother and his sister-in-law,
Roy and Edna Disney,
were trying to talk Walt out of doing it. Behind the scenes, Hollywood insiders were calling the movie Disney's Folly. Disney was betting absolutely everything on this one movie. All of his eggs were in this basket. It blew way past its initial budget, and by the time it was finally released, it cost $1.5 million. It got so bad that Walt ended up mortgaging his own house to finance this endeavor.
I didn't know what I had or what would happen or anything. We had the family fortune. We had everything wrapped up in Snow White. In fact, the banker, I think, was losing more sleep than I was.
About 2/3 of the way through the film, Disney realized he needed another $250,000 to actually put the finishing touches on it. So he went to Joseph Rosenberg at Bank of America with an early copy of the film. Rosenberg watched the entire thing completely emotionless. He then silently turned to Disney, paused for a beat, and said, "Walt, that thing is going to make a hatful of money." And then he approved the loan. And I have to re-record all this because I lost the footage.
I'm so sorry.
I am as well. Okay, where was I? I'm going to touch on the Brothers Grimm fairy tale here for a minute because it is the basis for the rest of the movie's plot. Now, the big plot points are all the same, but there are still some minor differences. The queen, Snow White's stepmother, asks a magic item who the fairest in the land is, and then she becomes envious when it turns out to be Snow White. So the queen then goes to the huntsman and asks him to take her out to the woods and kill her, but the huntsman just lets her go. Snow White runs into the woods and finds the dwarves who agree to let her live there. The queen then learns of the huntsman's betrayal and then decides to deal with Snow White herself, eventually convincing her to eat the poisoned apple. She's left unburied in a glass coffin until she's found by a prince who eventually wakes her, and they live happily ever after. Now let's get into what they changed. First of all, it was a magic looking glass, not a magic mirror. There was no true love's first kiss, and the queen was straight up a cannibal. She asks the huntsman to bring back Snow White's heart in a box, but instead the huntsman brings a pig's heart, which she then immediately devours. I assume just to make her seem more evil? There's really no reason for her to do this. She's not hungry at all. The queen also dies of, dancing? These are word for word the last lines of the fairy tale. And when she saw her, she knew for her Snow White, and could not stir from her place for anger and terror. for they had ready red-hot iron shoes, in which she had to dance, until she fell down dead. I'm pretty sure this is just a metaphor for envy, but being dropped off a cliff and being crushed by a boulder while vultures watch you is just more satisfying. I just realized that means they put her in red-hot iron shoes, which eventually kill her because they are red-hot and burning her feet off. Probably because of the murder and the cannibalism. I think the main difference between the movie and the fairy tale is that in the fairy tale, the queen feels much more like a main character. She has a lot more page time than screen time. She tries to kill Snow White 3 times, 4 times if you include the huntsman. First, she tries to asphyxiate Snow White with her own corset, then she tries to use a poisoned comb, and then finally she tries to use the poisoned apple, which that's the one that works. Well, works the best. Snow White is way more gullible in the fairy tale, and things sort of just happen at her. In the animation, she takes it upon herself to clean the house, which endears her to the dwarves, but in the fairy tale, she just kind of shows up, eats their food, and falls asleep in their bed. She is also incredibly gullible. Oh my god. 3 times the queen appears in disguise at their house. All 3 times the dwarves warn Snow White, hey, the queen is gonna appear here and try and kill you. And all 3 times, she just lets the queen in and do whatever the queen was gonna do. They're in a cabin in the woods and the nearest town is 7 mountains away. But 3 days in a row, Snow White gets a random traveler that shows up and tries to kill her with whatever she's selling, and Snow White just falls for it hook, line, and sinker every single time. The last major change I want to talk about is how Snow White is revived. In the movie, it's true love's first kiss. The prince kisses her, and true love saves the day. But in the book, her coffin is purchased by the prince, and while they are walking through the woods, they rock the apple out of her throat. They mentioned that the dwarves tried everything to resuscitate her. I guess they didn't try CPR.
First I was afraid, I was petrified.
This is an okay change because I think that it ties a theme into it. It's a little gross by today's standards, but at very least I could see what they were going for. So that's the material they're working from. They need to take the 7-page short story and stretch it into an 83-minute motion picture. In August of 1934, 21 pages of notes entitled Snow White Suggestions were compiled by the staff writer Richard Creedon. This suggested principal characters, situations, and sight gags that the animators could then weave into the plot. They had 3 major October meetings where Disney, Creedon, Larry Morey, Albert Herder, Ted Sears, and Pinto Colvig would all suggest different ways to make each and every scene more entertaining, with an emphasis on what Disney was calling screwiness and gags. Disney suggested in the very beginning that the dwarves all have personalities that match their names. In the original fairy tale, the dwarves didn't have names, but this ensemble gave the animators a blank canvas to project some really fun characteristics onto. There's a list of 50 dwarf names, all with corresponding gags and jokes that the animators could use to set their personalities. Jumpy, Deafy, Dizzy, Hickey, Wheezy, Baldy, Gabby, Nifty, Sniffy, Lazy, Puffy, Shorty, Tubby, Stubby, Burby, and Swift were a few of the names. Doc was chosen to be the leader of the dwarves early on, but the rest were chosen by multiple rounds of grueling elimination. By November, the dwarves consisted of Doc, Grumpy, Bashful, Sleepy, Happy, and Jumpy and Seventh were penciled in for the last 2. In the original notes, the queen had a lot of smaller comedic gags that would have all failed until she finally convinced Snow White to eat the apple. One gag would have included using a poisoned comb, as that's how it was done in the Brothers Grimm fairy tale, with the dwarves saving Snow White in the nick of time. In that version, after the queen failed, she was going to kidnap the prince and take him to her dungeon, where the skeletons were going to taunt him by dancing in front of him. She would have pointed out one of the skeletons and said, "This is Prince Oswald." And apparently that was supposed to be a joke. Maybe the dancing skeletons were a reference to the 1929 The Skeleton Dance, and Prince Oswald is a reference to Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. I don't know. I'm grasping at straws here. I we'll be honest, I don't think that joke would have landed. The queen then asks the prince to marry her, as if there is a single good reason for him to say yes. He says no, and she leaves the castle with the poisoned apple, leaving the prince for dead in her dungeon. The prince would escape with the help of the forest creatures, but because he can't understand them, he can't heed their instructions on how to get to the cottage where the witch was giving Snow White the apple.
According to the map, we've only gone about 4 inches.
Multiple sketches were done by Ferdinand Horvath of this deleted arc, but from the way it was described, it really would have just muddied the overall story, and it was probably for the best that it was cut. There were also a lot of suggestions to the Queen's character design. They wanted to make her a fat, batty, self-satisfied cartoon type. It's also worth pointing out that Disney has a thing for casting their villains to be just fat. They really like making their villains overweight. So it kind of makes sense that they wanted their first movie villain to be overweight as well. The prince was also going to be a lot more of a clown. He was supposed to sing poorly to Snow White in a way that kind of endears him, like, "Aw, you really suck at this, but you're trying, and that's what matters."
2, 3, 4.
The prince was going to have an extravagant musical number where he sang to Snow White as he sailed them through the stars in this dream sequence type thing. The stars were going to come in and sing with him. It was going to be a whole effects shindig, but it turns out that it was just way too overscoped. They didn't have time, and it honestly slowed the pace of the movie down, so it got cut pretty early on, but not before they were able to give us some concept art of it. Disney made a standing offer to the entire studio. $5 for every gag that anyone would contribute.
I'd pay you for a gag. If it was a good gag, you got $5, which is like getting 50 or 100 today. And I remember I sold a couple. When the dwarfs come into the bedroom and they sneak up and they peer over the top of the bed, and then as they come up, their noses pop over the top, one at a time. Boop, 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 boop. That was my gag, $5 worth.
By November, Disney was worried that the entire movie was too comedic and that the stakes wouldn't feel real. He decided to tone back the comic aspects of the Queen and the Prince, pouring all of that attention into the scenes with Snow White, the dwarves, and the animal friends. This is also the same month they solidified the seventh and arguably the most popular dwarf, Goopy. Goopy? Is it Goopy? Is Goopy the dwarf?
Which one?
I think this is supposed to say Dopey.
There is no Goopy. I think that there is a Dopey.
Dopey. It's got to be Dopey. I just spelled it wrong.
I like Goopy.
There probably was a Goopy at some point. Dopey.
In the story preparation for this, they had Dopey go the wrong way, and as he turned and came back, he was out of step, so he did a little hitch step to catch up. Well, so I did the hitch step. Turned out all right, and Walt said, "Hey, that's a good trait for Dopey. Let's have him, every time he's walking anywhere, he has to do a hitch step to keep up." Well, within 2 days, I had every animator in the place coming in and said, "It was your lousy hitch step that ruined my scene. I had that scene okayed for ink. That was finished a month ago, and now I got to hold back and put in a hitch step." It wasn't my fault. It was in the story.
For the rest of 1934, Disney himself would work on the story. His biggest problem was that the Queen's design was still, quote, fat and batty, when he felt she needed to be more of a, quote, stately beautiful type. This is when the Queen's character design went from being that fat, batty character over to the slender, imposing character that we know today. Snow White herself also went through a lot of iterations. She started out looking a lot like Betty Boop, and when you consider who was drawing her, that makes sense. Much like the Queen and the Prince, after a couple of more cartoony designs, they eventually settled on something with much more realistic proportions. In the end, all of the human characters just looked a lot more realistic than all of the animals and dwarves, which kind of actually worked in the movie's favor. In 1935, Disney put the production on a brief pause. The Silly Symphony, The Goddess of Spring, that came out in 1934, was casting doubt on the studio's ability to animate a girl with realistic proportions. He took a 3-month vacation in Europe, and when he returned, he focused specifically on the scenes where Snow White and the dwarves were being introduced to each other, and the audience. By November of 1935, everyone had their work in front of them, and the characters were finalized. Disney had made some last-minute changes to the story. Originally, the story would focus on the dwarves, but at the last second, Disney rewrote the script to focus more on the relationship between Snow White and the Queen. A lot of the dwarf scenes were cut last minute, with one of them having been completely animated. It featured Doc and Grumpy arguing about whether or not Snow White should stay with them. This one was cut because it was a conversation between the dwarves before Snow White was introduced to them. And since now the perspective followed Snow White, the audience shouldn't know the dwarves yet. It completely changes the pace of the film and honestly fixes the perspective of the movie as a whole.
While this animation was still in the preliminary or pencil phase, we found that the overall picture was too long. Something had to be left out, and this was it. You see, even though we liked the sequence, it was not essential to the telling of the story. So when you look at this sequence, it won't look like the picture as you remember seeing it in the theater. Instead, you will see the animator's original pencil drawing.
Other cut scenes include Snow White teaching the dwarves table manners, a lodge meeting where the dwarves think of a gift for Snow White, and a subsequent bed building scene that, if they left in, really would have slowed the pace of the movie down dramatically. Both scenes were either completely or partially animated by Ward Kimball, who threatened to quit the studio after everything was cut. Disney ended up promoting Kimball because he wanted to recognize his good animation work. And even though the rest of his work on Snow White was minimal, he would go on to be the supervising director of Jiminy Cricket and Pinocchio. At the end of the story development, they had a much more grounded story than they had originally started with. Grounding the story to the Queen's more serious plot really let the dwarfs' comedic moments shine, and honestly, everything just balanced out perfectly. As for the animation itself, everything fell back onto concept artist Albert Herder. Everything from the character designs to the rocks in the background, it all had to be okayed by Albert himself. He and the other two concept artists, Ferdinand Hovarth and Gustav Tengren, all worked together to develop the final look and feel of the motion picture. The first sketches were dark and very detailed, reflecting that dark and grim atmosphere that the original fairy tale was presenting. It took a few iterations before the Disney team landed on something that they felt they could actually animate. In 1932, Art Babbitt was signed to Disney as a full-time animator. He brought his 7 colleagues, all of whom worked in the same room as him, to an art class that he ran himself out of his home in the Hollywood Hills. There was no teacher. He hired a model to come to his home and then pose for them to all do gesture drawings of, and they would critique each other's work. These classes were held weekly, and each week they'd have more animators than the last. When Disney got back from his vacation, he caught word of these classes and offered to move the entire class to the studio, where he would provide the supplies, the workplace, and the model. Babbitt ran these classes for about a month until another animator, Artie Grammatke, suggested that they recruit Don Graham, an art teacher at the Cho and Art Institute, to teach these classes full-time. This class became the answer to Disney's concerns about the animators being able to draw human figures, as they dramatically improved the technical skills of all the animators who attended them. It wasn't an easy class, not by any means. Graham was not versed in animation, so he didn't understand the technical aspects of what corners needed to be cut to make a character animatable, but he was a savant when it came to anatomy. The students, all of whom have experience in animation, and the teacher, who has a much more traditional background, really butted heads every class, with one of the animators describing each class as a brutal battle between them. Graham was eventually brought in as a consultant for unreleased Disney shorts, where he gave feedback on the animations of the class. Now at that time, very few animators had animation training. It just wasn't really a thing yet. Most of them were taken directly from newspaper comic strips. One of the ones that did was Grimm Natwick, who is credited for designing and animating Betty Boop for the Fleischer Studios. When he was brought in, he was hired to work on female characters exclusively. This included Persephone, the main character from Goddess of Spring, the specific reason why Disney was worried that his animators might not be able to draw realistic proportions for the movie. Natwick showed improvement when he animated the main heroine from Cookie Carnival, but now he was being tasked with animating Snow White for the entire movie. Reference was shot for every scene involving the Queen, Snow White, and the Prince, but this was specifically for reference, not for rotoscoping. Rotoscoping at this point had fallen out of favor, and something that most animators saw as more of a crutch, something that stopped you from making an effective caricature. There was a lot of internal debate about whether or not they should use this for the movie, but eventually the staff settled on using it specifically for the main human characters. Now, some of the scenes just used rotoscope as the base of the animation, and then the animators worked on top of it, but other scenes were just 100% rotoscoped. The last big animation problem that Disney ran into was coloring the Queen and Snow White's faces. They found a red dye that worked pretty well, but when you applied it directly, it was way too vibrant. So what they did was they diluted it by dipping it in a cotton swab and then tying the cotton swab to a pencil before lightly dabbing it onto each individual cell. This process was tedious and time-consuming, and it mostly fell on a single employee in the ink department. Looking into it a little further, the red dye that was used on Snow White's face was actually just makeup. Regular, straight-up, human-grade makeup.
The women in the ink and paint department devised their own unique method of making Snow White's face seem more natural by applying real rouge and other makeup directly to the top of the cell. Walt conceded that it looked great, but was concerned that they know exactly where to put the makeup on each drawing. One of the inkers replied, "Mr. Disney, what do you think we do each morning?"
Helen Offer was an employee in the ink department, and she's pretty much the reason why this very tedious and time-consuming task was even an option for Disney to pursue. It was never used on such a degree. It was used a little bit in Fantasia and Pinocchio, but nowhere near as much as it was in Snow White. And when she left the studio in 1941, no one could replace her. Hey, really quick, if you don't mind clicking back into the video and just checking this out for a second, because this is pretty cool. I want you to see this. Check out this shot. Okay. To this day, we have no idea how they pulled this off. There's no actual written record of it, and I can't find anything that says what they did to do it. It's implied that they used the multiplane camera somehow, but how? It doesn't work like Photoshop where you could just change one layer and it affects the layers beneath it. It's opaque. So nobody knows how they were able to actually pull off this effect. This is insanity. Just wanted to point this out here because it's like a 3-second shot and I love it. They actually use the multiplane camera in a couple of places. Another one that's notable is right here, where the Queen changes her appearance to look like the hag so that she can give Snow White the apple. They have a foreground and a background. They're using 3 specific layers. The Queen stays still while the foreground moves to the left and the background moves to the right. Changing the direction like this causes the room to spin in a way that simply was never seen before. The multiplane camera gave them 5 layers to work with, and Disney really tried to explore with all 5 of them. Anytime they could use the multiplane camera, they did, and it really pays off. The last shot I wanted to talk about was this one, the shimmer on the diamonds that the dwarves are digging up. Each shimmer is painted onto a separate layer of celluloid, which is then layered over the final ink drawing. What makes this so impressive is the sheer scope of the timing work that needed to be done in order to make sure that the shimmer didn't stutter or skip frames. Now, they could use multiple layers of celluloid, but realistically they wouldn't use more than 1 or 2. Celluloid can get unmanageable, especially when you get up to 3 or 4 layers. Meaning these shimmers had to constantly be checked against the other layers to make sure that the shimmers didn't overlap. Each shimmer also had to keep its shape and size as the camera moved, and the color had to remain consistent. This is the result of an amazing show of patience from the effects department, and it really paid off here. This is it. After everything they've gone through, all the artistic struggles, all the financial problems, every single little hurdle they encountered along the way, it has all led to this. December 21st, 1937. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs makes its premiere at the Carthay Circle Theater. If this fails, Disney is sunk. Not just the studio, but Walt himself. Remember, he took out a mortgage for this movie. He needs this movie to do well. He needs it to impress the distributors, and then he needs it to do well after it's distributed. If it doesn't, everything is for nothing. All of his eggs are in one basket here.
Blasé Hollywood, accustomed to gala openings, turns out for the most spectacular of them all, the world premiere of the $1.5 million fairy tale fantasy, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Replicas from the first feature cartoon thrill thousands who turn out for a glimpse of lovely Marlene Dietrich with Doug Fairbanks Jr. and a parade of stars. Shirley Temple is just as enthralled as are the grown-up stars and moviegoers with the 7 fantastic dwarfs.
And when the movie was over, the crowd immediately erupted into a standing ovation. 6 days later, Walt and the 7 Dwarves appear on the cover of Time magazine. 3 weeks after that, they have a limited release at the Radio City Music Hall in New York. Massive box office sales at Radio City encourage RKO for a more general release and distribution. Upon its initial release in America and Canada, the film makes back its budget and then some. It displaces the most popular sound film of all time, The Singing Fool by Al Jolson, which took the crown a decade before in 1928. The film did so well it garnered a foreign release in Europe and in Australia. In September of 1938, Vanity Fair reports that Snow White breaks box office records by running in Sydney for 11 straight weeks and still going strong. The film actually performed better in London than it did in New York. According to RKO, Snow White earned $7.8 million in the international box office after its theatrical run. Now, the box office numbers are a little screwy because it was re-released into the box office in 1944, 52, 58, 67, 75, 83, 89, and 93, and whenever Disney needs a new yacht. Over its lifetime, the movie grossed $418 million over the multiple releases, which makes it difficult to account for inflation on how much this movie actually made. Needless to say, Disney didn't go bankrupt. On a final budget of $1.5 million, Snow White earned $12 million in the box office. Not just that, Disney established himself as the first man to make a full feature-length animated movie.
I'm sure the boys and girls in the whole world are going to be very happy when they find out that the daddy of Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs, Ferdinand, Mickey Mouse, and all the others, is going to get this beautiful statue. Isn't it bright and shiny?
Oh, it's beautiful.
Aren't you proud of it, Mr. Disney?
Well, I'm so proud I think I'll bust. You know, I think that Mickey Mouse and Ferdinand and Snow White and all the dwarfs are going to be very proud that you presented it.
I'm glad.
I don't agree with everything Disney did, nor some of his more troublesome takes on life, but this video isn't about that. It's not a takedown. In fact, it's just the opposite. He's a man who took risk after risk, encountered failure after failure, only to build himself up to the position we find him in today. He pushed through laughograms, living out of his office and showering at the train station. When Oswald the Lucky Rabbit was taken from him, he simply made a better character from the comfort of his own company less than a year later. And when the entire world was laughing at his attempt to make a movie this ambitious, his own family telling him to give up, he literally bet his own house on himself and won. Disney was complicated, but he had a drive that I think we can all admire. He truly loved what he was doing, and it shows in the work that he leaves behind today. Disney now established himself as the man who created the first animated motion picture. His name was now synonymous with quality storytelling and state-of-the-art animation techniques. He immediately turns around and puts a pause on making the shorts so that he can focus most of his energy on making more movies. Disney's going to have their first golden age in a turbulent time for the world. We're going to discuss how Disney moves past this, what their next steps are, what their next movie is. And we're also going to talk about how other animation studios react to the first feature-length motion picture. More than that, though, we're going to talk about how cartoons are weaponized during World War II. I'm going on a brief hiatus. I hope you've enjoyed this season. I'm calling this a season. I don't know why, but get over it. This is a season. I think each one will be about 5 episodes long. So after the hiatus, which is going to give me... I probably need about a year to make a whole new season, and then I'll release them the same way I've been releasing these month by month. So hope to see you then. And until then, I hope you enjoyed this. See ya. I'm gonna suck soak up the sun. I'm gonna tell everyone to lighten up. I'm gonna tell them that I got no one to blame. For every time I feel lame, I'm looking up. I'm gonna soak up the sun. I'm gonna soak up the sun.